Welcome everyone to my online course for research methods in psychology. My name is Frank Losciavo and I am your instructor. I have lots of interesting things to discuss, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. You might recall that in this chapter, we've been discussing sources of information. We've essentially been asking ourselves, how do you know what you know? In other words, where did your information about human thought and behavior come from? In the last video, we discussed that one source of information is our own personal experience. And although our personal experiences teach us quite a bit about human psychology, we learned that our personal lives lack control groups, and our personal lives are filled with confounds. So, when we're trying to learn about human thought and behavior, it's really much better to rely on scientific research. Well, the same is true of our intuition. Although you might think your intuitive hunches about people are spot on, generally speaking, our intuition suffers from several predictable biases. In this video, I'll discuss a few of those biases. And along the way, I'll point out that scientific methods provide us with many useful options for reducing or even eliminating those biases. All right, let's get to work. I mentioned that our intuition suffers from several predictable biases. If our intuition wasn't biased at all, then we would take appropriate notice of everything important about human thought and behavior, process that information, and we'd ignore all the rest. Unfortunately, that's not how the human mind works. For example, when making sense of the world, there are some things that we take too seriously. In other words, we're overly influenced by some of the information we collect. We give that information too much weight, too much credibility. This is particularly true when we hear a good story. The textbook provides a good example regarding the Scared Straight program. Long ago, I watched a documentary about the original Scared Straight program from the 1970s. The general idea for the program makes sense. You take a bunch of kids, many who have been in trouble with the law. You send those kids into a prison, where they'll meet with hardened inmates, many serving life sentences. The inmates threaten the kids, they get right up in their faces, and they generally do a good job of scaring the kids into realizing that they don't want to end up in prison. So, as I'm sure you understand, the goal of the program is to scare the kids straight, scare them into leading a better life. It's a great story. The program makes sense. It's intuitive. It feels like it should work. And that bias prompts us to believe that it does work. Do you see my point? We get so sucked into a great story that we intuitively buy into it. We accept it. We embrace it. We start thinking, that's a great idea, a great program. We need more programs that scare kids into following the law. Well, we need to understand that bias, and we need to protect ourselves from it. How can we protect ourselves? You should know that answer by now. Instead of relying on our own personal experience, our own intuition, we should rely on scientific research to provide us with answers about human thought and behavior. So, what does the research say about Scared Straight programs? In general, researchers have found that the programs are ineffective and that they might do more harm than good. For example, the U.S. Department of Justice reviewed published studies that compared kids who participated in Scared Straight programs with kids in a control group. That included nearly 1,000 kids across 9 different research studies. Here are their conclusions. This review finds no evidence that Scared Straight and other juvenile awareness programs have crime control effects. In fact, all analyses showed that involvement in these programs increased measures of crime and delinquency. That's not good, people. You see my point? We need to rely less on vivid stories, less on our intuition, and more on scientific research. You know, those good stories bias our intuitions in another way as well. When we hear something impactful or see something vivid, we tend to remember it, and oftentimes those memories stay top of mind. I'm sure you understand that when I say something is top of mind, I'm saying that particular memory comes to our mind very easily. So, in other words, we can say that top-of-mind memories are more available to us. Well, these highly accessible, highly available thoughts and memories are likely to influence and bias our current and future thinking. So, Moving forward throughout our lives, our thoughts may be colored by those previously impactful, vivid events that stay top of mind. That's what the availability heuristic is all about. By the way, a heuristic is just a mental shortcut that allows us to make quick judgments and fast decisions. In this case, thoughts and memories that quickly and easily come to mind become prominent factors in our thought processes. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when I say that these highly available thoughts tend to influence us moving forward, what I'm really saying is that these highly available thoughts and memories tend to overly influence our thought processes. If you haven't figured it out by now, to be overly influenced by something is to be biased by something. So, as a result, highly available thoughts often lead us to overestimate how often things occur. For example, I'm a college professor and you're a student. So when there's a school shooting in the news, we pay attention to it. We want to know about it. We spend a lot of time at school, or we have family and friends who spend a lot of time at school. So thoughts about school shootings stick with us. They stay top of mind. In other words, thoughts and memories of school shootings become highly accessible to us. They remain highly available in our minds, and as a result, those thoughts tend to influence our thought processes. So, if we were to estimate how often school shootings occur, we'd likely overestimate how common they are, at least when compared to others who don't pay quite as much attention to school shootings as we do. In addition, we'd probably overestimate how likely it is for us to become victims. Of course, school shootings do occur, and there is a possibility that we could become victims, but if we are overestimating the likelihood of those events, then our thought processes are not well calibrated. In other words, if we're overestimating the likelihood of those events, then our thought processes are biased, and to some extent, that might be due to the availability heuristic. To make matters worse, we have a tendency to seek out and accept information only if it's consistent with what we already believe or what we want to believe. For example, if I'm concerned about school shootings, I'm likely to seek out and embrace information that confirms my beliefs about school violence. After all, when I find information that confirms what I'm thinking, to some extent that validates who I am. It confirms that I'm intelligent and that I understand what's going on in the world. That's what confirmation bias is all about, seeking out and readily accepting information that confirms our beliefs. In addition to seeking out information that confirms our views, we also tend to avoid information that might disconfirm our views. For example, if I'm concerned about school shootings, I'm unlikely to seek out a report that suggests schools are relatively safe places to be. That's a big problem, my friends. Due to confirmation bias, we might naturally avoid the truth. Sometimes the truth hurts because it forces us to question our beliefs. It forces us to question what we stand for. But, my friends, you might recall that the goal of scientific research is to seek the truth. We certainly don't want to run from it. If anything, we want to run toward the truth, even if it rocks our world. So, scientists need to be skeptical about everything. They need to question everything. They need to be willing to abandon their beliefs if the data proves those beliefs are false. In other words, scientists need to design research that goes to battle with their biases. They need to be open to whatever the data might say. People, you need to understand that our brains lie to us every day. Fortunately, research data is likely to be more honest. So far, to this point, I've discussed how we're overly influenced by things that are impactful, prominent, vivid, and top of mind. That shouldn't be surprising. It makes sense that we're overly influenced by things that are right there in front of us, in our faces. Next, let's discuss a few biases that work in the opposite direction. Sometimes we fail to notice important things, often because those things are not so obvious. For example, in a previous video, I described how important comparison groups are. For instance, if you're taking medication for depression, you might think the medication is effective because you're feeling pretty good. However, we can't conclude that the medication is effective until we compare your results with an appropriate control group. In this case, it would be wise to determine how you're feeling without taking any medication at all. It's easy to overlook the importance of that comparison. In fact, we're likely to focus on outcomes, like your mood, when factors are present, such as when you're taking medication, but overlook outcomes, like your mood, when factors are absent, such as when you're not taking medication. That's what the present-present bias is all about. We tend to notice outcomes when key factors are present, and thus we tend to be influenced by those present factors. However, we tend to overlook outcomes when key factors are absent. As a result, our judgment is often biased because we make those judgments based on limited information, incomplete information. Let's walk through another example. This example is based on the catharsis research we discussed earlier this semester. You might recall that the catharsis hypothesis states that venting frustration, venting anger, allows us to release those negative emotions. And as a result, we might be less aggressive toward those who caused our anger and frustration in the first place. This 2x2 grid helps us see all 4 possible scenarios. So, for example, in any given situation, you might vent your frustration, and as a result, you might feel better. Of the 4 possible scenarios shown in the grid, that scenario is shown in red. Out of 30 possible outcomes summarized by the grid, that one occurred 5 times. You can see that's the scenario where venting frustration is present and when feeling better is present. In other words, it's the scenario when you vented your frustration and it worked out well. You felt better because of it. According to the present-present bias, that's the scenario we pay most attention to. It's the scenario we tend to notice more than others. But there are 3 other possible scenarios, right? And if we want to better understand the catharsis hypothesis, we need to look at those situations as well. For example, according to the grid, there were 10 instances out of 30 where you kept your frustration bottled up. In other words, venting was absent, but you still felt fine. And there were 10 other instances in which you vented your frustration and felt worse as a result. In other words, in that situation, the intended outcome, feeling better, was absent. My friends, throughout our lives, as we intuitively try to make sense of human thought and behavior, we tend to overlook those scenarios. That's a problem. Out of 4 possible scenarios, we tend to give more weight. In other words, we tend to pay more attention to the one that's easiest to notice. That's the one that has both key factors present. As researchers, we need to avoid that type of bias. We need to design research studies that explore all possible scenarios so that we can draw conclusions about human beings based on a more complete understanding of all possible outcomes. That's not always easy. In fact, it's never easy to tame our biases because they're natural. I know it sounds strange, but biased thinking is natural. It's common. In fact, biased thinking is so common, so natural, that many people deny that they are biased thinkers. And they're unable to detect when they're thinking in a biased way. In this sense, we suffer from a blind spot, a bias blind spot. Bias is there, it's part of our lives, but we often don't see it. And that's very dangerous, my friends, because when you don't see bias, you fall victim to it. This underscores how important it is to think like a scientist. Scientists aren't necessarily smarter than anyone else, but scientists typically understand their own limitations, their own biases. And instead of relying on their faulty intuition, they rely on research data to draw their conclusions about human thought and behavior. Well, that's it for this section, but stay tuned because I'll have more to say about research methods in the next video.